So hopefully you saw in the email that our topic for today is on emotional and mental well-being under lockdown. It just seems such a huge topic for us in these days, as we're facing restrictions again, that we thought we should speak into it. Mental well-being or mental health is not something that the church talks about all that much, but actually it's been a huge part of the church. Martin Luther, the reformer, struggled with chronic anxiety and depression. Charles Spurgeon, the famous Baptist preacher, struggled with chronic depression too. Florence Nightingale had terrible bipolar disorder. John Bunyan had crippling obsessive compulsive disorder. And William Cowper wrote the hymn, "There is a fountain filled with blood," after his second attempt at suicide. So why? Why is this such a big issue in so many lives? What I want to do very briefly before Joan comes to speak is to share a little using the storyline of Scripture on what the Bible might say about mental and emotional well-being. The storyline of Scripture is taking creation and fall, Israel, then Jesus, and looking forward to the culmination of the world and the new creation. I'm going to skip Israel this today, as I'm trying to do this in 5 minutes, but we'll look briefly at the other ones. And what we see when we look at creation is that God created a good world, and that included a good and healthy humanity, including their emotional well-being. In the second creation story, at the end of Genesis 2, it says that Adam and Eve were both naked and felt no shame. It's a lovely picture there of well-being, to be open and exposed like that and feel no shame. But then we know that in the fall, recorded for us in Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve walked a different path from God's path, the impact of that meant that the whole world fell into disrepair. Every aspect and part of the world, all of life, was affected by the fall. We live in a broken world. So we know, most obviously, when it comes to our spiritual well-being, that there's now distance in the relationship between us and God, that we're separated. We know that our relationships have been affected too. Straight after the sin, when God speaks to Adam and asks what happened, he's like, this woman, he's blaming already Adam, and relationships are affected. And our relationship with the natural world, with work, all of life is affected. It talks about how hardship came in to affect that. But also our emotional and mental well-being is affected by the fall too. Genesis 3 talks about how Adam and Eve realized they were naked post the fall. That their self-awareness grew in a negative way as a result, a consequence of the fall. So every part of life is affected by the fall. But it's important for us to realize that, important for us to realize the impact of the fall. And it means that we don't really need to be ashamed about these things, that it's not sinful or wrong to struggle in different ways. As Christians, let's take all of that aside and put it away. This is just part of a broken world. So we should feel free to be able to talk about it, particularly as talking is so helpful. So our issues in emotional and mental health come through the fall. I want to fast forward to Jesus here and show that as God entered into this world as a human person, he took on all the frailties of human life, including our struggles with emotional and mental health. Lots of the trigger points for mental health are things that Jesus himself experienced. He was rejected too, rejected by his own people, the Jews, and indeed rejected by his own followers at the end of his life. Jesus experienced grief and bereavement. John 11 records the death of Lazarus, but reading between the lines, it seems likely that Jesus experienced the death of his father Joseph as well, as he doesn't get further mention in the scriptures past age 12 for Jesus. Identity issues are a massive thing in our contemporary conversation around mental well-being. And Jesus struggled there. There are lots of passages in the Gospels where Jesus heals someone or someone recognizes who he is, and Jesus tells them not to go and say that he's the Messiah. It's known as the Messianic secret. But it means that Jesus had to conceal his true identity in some way in the start of his ministry. And then at the end of his ministry, his true identity is out as Messiah, and he is unjustly persecuted for that. And his trial and his death is over that claim. Jesus experienced pain and disappointment and failure. He has to lament over Jerusalem, that symbol and city of his people, because they don't follow him. He suffered tremendous stress. Think of the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke records it as anguish and talks of sweat like drops of blood. In Mark's account, it says this. This is Jesus speaking in the garden. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Now just reread that sentence again through a lens of mental well-being. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And at times in our world, even though we're getting better in our culture at talking about these issues, there can be a label attached to emotional and mental well-being, and Jesus experienced that too. He was accused by his own family of being mad. In Mark chapter 3, they say he is out of his mind. So these are all aspects of our broader well-being that Jesus had issues and struggles with in his own life by taking on human flesh. He knows what it's like, and he can help us. But the last part of the biblical story is new creation, that we will receive new bodies and there will be a whole new world. And everything will be made new. And that includes our well-being, our emotional and mental well-being will be made new. And we'll be fully whole and healthy people. So let us look forward to that. I'm going to hand over to Joan now. Joan is going to talk in a more practical way about these issues. But I encourage you also, on Wednesday night, we're going to have a seminar. It's going to be on Zoom again at 8 o'clock just for us as a church, where we're going to talk about these issues in a little bit more detail, have a little bit more time to do it, and reflect on where we're at and pray. So I encourage you to come, just so that we as a church can support each other in these issues by becoming more aware of it, and also manage our own well-being during this lockdown. So that is going to be Wednesday night this week, so do come to that. Thank you. Joan.
This is a huge subject, but just want to kind of talk some things about it. And then, as Fraser said, if you can come on Wednesday, it'd be helpful if you could have Psalm 62 visible in front of you that Clementina read for us. And Peter read this in church back in October, and it has been with me ever since. So thank you, Peter. And out of this has come a sentence that has been going round and round in my heart as I've thought and I've prayed. And it's this, and I'm going to go through it. How do we manage these days? We face these days honestly, together with God. And I'm just going to go through that, each part of it. So the first point is this, and just so that you're aware, there are 4 points. So the first one is this: we face these days together. We need each other. Isolation is a dreadful thing, and it is still used in parts of the world as a form of torture, putting people into solitary confinement. And one of the worst things that people are facing today is being on their own or feeling that they're on their own. I listened recently to a talk by a consultant clinical psychologist about stress, and this has been recommended by the HSE and is being recommended that a lot of health workers watch it and others. He had several headings, but one of his key ones was connect. He said this, and I quote, "It is very important that we feel part of something that is bigger than ourselves. so encouraging when you hear biblical truth from somebody like that, that we are part of the body of Christ and we need each other. And it really helps us if we can give active expression to that by being involved in church, even on Zoom, that many of us find difficult, and that we also think, how can we connect to others in church during the week? Last night was one example of that, a bit rowdy example of that in the games night. Thank you, James. But there are many ways during the week that we can get involved with each other. And here's a thought for you. We get involved in some of those things for our own benefit, but actually one of the reasons we get involved and show up is because it'll encourage other people who are there. So it's a two-way thing. So we think about that, and that we think of how we can keep in touch with other people. If we're feeling isolated, maybe we need to take the initiative and make contact with someone. Because when we're feeling isolated, we can feel very alone and almost are waiting for people to contact us. But it can be really good if we just take the initiative and contact someone. So this week, very practically, let us ask God who he would want us to text, email, send a card to, whatever. A major thing that affects our day-to-day well-being is our expectations of life. An illustration I've used sometimes with students, very basic about this, is I've said to them, imagine if this next week all you had to eat every day was a bowl of rice. Would you be happy? And most of them go, what? No way. And then I say, well, okay, imagine you hadn't eaten anything for a month. Would you be happy? That's just to show the example that I think one of the things a lot of us are struggling with is that when life isn't meeting our expectations at the minute. And we need to think through that. For instance, give you a very basic example. If I expect every day that 2 people are going to contact me, I'm going to be very disappointed if it doesn't happen. But if I don't expect anybody to contact me and one person does, then I'll be very happy. Do you see what I mean? We need to think if our expectations are realistic. And here's the thing about us as believers. Why do we get so hurt and disappointed when other Christians let us down? When we know our own hearts? Because so often we do get hurt by each other. But we are redeemed people and we're forgiven, but we're not perfect. And we're going to hurt and disappoint us. And one of the things about being part of a church community is being willing to forgive each other and accept each other as we are. So how do we face this? We need to face it together and think through what that means. But we also face these days together, this is point 2, with God. He is with us, and God can actually enable us to face any circumstances as we trust him. And Zoe was talking helpfully about that. We have normally, and even now, we have lots of good things in our lives, really good things that God has given us to enjoy. But I suppose one of the things I've been thinking about is that the danger that those good things and activities can become the main thing in my life, and my knowledge of God be a bit secondhand. And one of the challenges of these days, I think, is for us all just to step back and look at our relationship with God and think about it. I would never easily starve myself because I love food too much. But I know there's times in my life when I've starved myself spiritually and then wondered why I was so spiritually dry. If I can use an illustration, and you can all see me, so this should work. Sometimes here's what I've done to God and to fellowship, right? I've turned my back and then I've said, God, where are you? Why don't you care? Sometimes we can, as it were, not be trusting God and then wonder why we don't feel that active connection with him. I'd like you to do something for me now. Keep yourselves muted, but I'd like you all to read Psalm 62, verses 5 to 7. Now, if you several of you, you can decide one person will read it. but I'm going to give you time just to do that right now. Keep yourselves muted, but read Psalm 62, 5-7. Off you go. Okay, I think I can sense that most people have stopped. Here's the interesting thing. If you look back at verse 1, David the psalmist says, "My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him." And then if you look at verse 5 that you read, he says, "Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him." See, sometimes it's as though we actually need to talk to ourselves and remind ourselves of the hope and the trust that we do have in God. And as Fraser talked about 2 weeks ago, God has given us his word. God is never boring. The Bible is never boring, but we can make our relationship with God and with the scriptures really boring. And one of the good things to do is to think about different ways we can engage with the Bible, different ways we can engage in prayer and in our relationship with God, and then share those ideas with each other to benefit each other. But I don't just mean that to face these days, we need to spend time alone with God, praying, worshiping, reading the Bible, listening to him, etc. But God needs to be the foundation for everything in our lives. How we listen to the news, how we hear the depressing news, how we are with people, what we watch on TV, what we watch and engage with in our computers, not compartmentalizing our lives, but living all of our lives together with God. And that's why it's been partly so good to have this Time Tomorrow slot, just showing how all our lives are lived for God. Back to that psychologist and another quote. Here's what he said: "If our actions are really consistent with our values, it gives us protection against stress. If there's a gap between our values and our actions, stress pours in." I almost cheered when I heard him saying that, because he's just speaking God's truth. Key point is, are we living what we believe? So we need to be actively engaged with God and all that he has provided. I had a very vivid example of that back in the summer. We had a, you know, I like gardening. We had a clematis growing up our wall, and it, for the last few years, hasn't produced, well, last 2 years, it hasn't produced many flowers. So I lost patience. So I said to Stephen, because he does the heavy work, I said to Stephen, could you just cut that off? Because it's attached to the wall. Could you just cut it off above the ground, above the roots? And then it should be easier, hopefully, to take off the wall. Well, within 1 day, it had wilted. And within 3 days, it was so easy to pull it off the wall because it was dead. And I stood there looking at this thing thinking, oh dear, what a brilliant illustration. God is our roots. To keep that vital sap, that connection, we need to stay connected with him, but we need to help each other to do that, because these days are really difficult. So we need to help each other. So we face these days honestly together with God. Point 3, we face these days honestly together with God. We need to have people that we can be really honest with. I found it amusing recently, conversations I've had with people, and I've done it myself. So I say to somebody, maybe on the phone or whatever, how are you doing? And they'll start talking and saying, well, actually, I'm finding life really tough. And then it's as though they go, and they say, oh, but really, I know my life is nothing compared to the difficulty of people in hospital and health workers. And I know so many other people are worse off than me. Now, there's a sense in which that is good, that we realize, you know, we've got good things, but there's a thing about it that isn't good. We need to have somebody or some people that we can be truly honest with, and they'll let us say it. And they'll let us be emotional if we need to, and they'll let us just talk about the things in our lives and the things through all of this that we're finding really difficult. I've been thinking recently about what is reassurance. Think about this. If somebody tells you they're really worried, and you think, oh, I need a reassurance, you say to them, oh, you don't need to be worried. What are we actually doing? That's not actually reassuring. What we're doing is saying to them, you shouldn't be worried, and it can produce guilt. So we need to be able to be honest. That means we need to be willing to listen to people being honest and let them, and not try and close them down with, you know, reassurance. It's difficult to do, and it can be difficult, but we need to be really honest. And look at verse 8. And this is the verse that has really been with me the whole way through. Verse 8 in Psalm 62 says this: trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Trusting God and pouring out our hearts to him are not opposites. That's the thing that really encouraged me. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him. We are trusting God. We really are doing our best to trust him. But some days when we're finding it, just you get up another morning and you think, oh no, we need to have people who will listen when we need to talk, and we need to be willing to talk when we need to. So we need to face these days together with God and honestly. And the fourth point, the last one, is this: we face these days honestly together with God. We need to face it. The danger is that every day we just wish it wasn't like this. We miss the good things, we miss the life before, we miss our freedom. But I've come to realize this is an opportunity for me to get to know myself better, to get to know God better, to get to know all of you better, and let God teach me things. We need to face it and not suppress it. Think of it like this: if you have a cut on your hand or your leg, if it's treated, it will heal. If you hide it, it will fester. So we need to kind of face how we're feeling. It's almost a chance to kind of step back and look at our lives and think, what am I missing and why am I missing it? Now, there's lots of good things that we're missing and we want to go back to. But I just got this picture one day of me being in a room and having a screen in front of me and being busy and doing all these things, and Jesus coming into the room and standing behind me and saying my name, and I don't even hear him because I'm so busy with all the things, not just the screen, but so busy with all the things in my life. Now, don't get me wrong, these things are good, but I'm going to give you a very personal example. I have realized, looking back, I like shopping. Okay, that's good. Stephen, hear this. This is good. Shopping is good. Buying things are good. Please don't hear me saying that that's a bad thing. It's not. One of the ways I relax is going out to shopping centres and just pottering, just wandering around and looking at things. But God has made me aware of one thing, that in the past, there were days when I was feeling bad. There was something in my life that I wasn't happy with. There was something that God is trying to say to me. And do you know what I would do? I would go out to a shopping centre and buy something to make me feel better. Something that I didn't need at all, just to make me feel better. Now, please, to go and buy something to make yourself feel good is good, but for me, not good if it's avoidance. And I don't mean to be sexist, but for some of you men, you might think, well, I'm not wanting to go out to a shopping centre and buy myself a new jumper or whatever, but it could be some bit of technology or something for the computer. And I know I'm being sexist, so you'll just have to forgive me on that one. But I suppose just thinking about, what do we rely on every week to make us feel good? I've been thinking about that. Where does my joy come from? What am I relying on to get me through life? Do we want to just go back to pre-COVID ways of living? Well, I don't. See, here's a statement: practice makes perfect. That's rubbish. Practice does not make perfect if it's bad practice. Practice simply makes permanent. And I think God is giving us all a real opportunity to just look at our lives, think of our mental and emotional health. What are we using to make us feel better? Some of those things are good. I've never done so many jigsaws as I have recently, and I've really enjoyed that. I'm not saying that there aren't things that are good, but we need to think about the source. Is it that our roots are deep down into God, and then we can enjoy all these other things that He has given us? And just before I finish, another program that I watched on stress pre-COVID, RTE program. They took 4 people who had really stressful lives and they tried to help them. One woman, they sent her to a very expensive counsellor. And you know what the counsellor told her to do? She said, get yourself a notebook, and every night before you go to bed, write in your notebook 3 things that you're thankful for. And again, I thought, God's truth. So one of the things we can do that actually will help us is not to ignore the bad stuff and the rubbish and the stuff we're finding really hard, and to be honest and talk about that, but at the same time to find something every day that we're thankful for, and actually to consciously do that will really, really help us. Psalm 62 says this: find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from Him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress, I shall not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in Him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to Him, for God is our refuge. Trust Him, but pour out your heart to Him. And we need to let others pour out our hearts to us and to listen. None of us function perfectly physically in this fallen world. Well, none of us work perfectly psychologically, emotionally, and mentally. We're all flawed and we need help from others. But one of the ways we can do that is to be honest about some of those things. When I suffered depression years ago, one of the things I found hardest was I felt that people didn't want to know. Most people. They wanted the old, bouncy, happy Joan. They didn't want miserable, moaning Joan, or that's how I felt. That's one of the things that made it harder. So this is only an introduction. We would love to chat more on Wednesday night. Let's just pray together.